Quintus Oppius, Legate 89 to 88 BCE. During the First Mithridatic War, 3 Roman commanders took the field with sizable allied armies in the hopes of stymieing the wily Pontic king's designs on the small kingdoms of Bithynia and Cappadocia. The commander of the eastern army in Cappadocia was Quintus Oppius, a man from a well-known, if somewhat undistinguished, family. Due to circumstances beyond his control, the war effort began to unravel. Like Varro at Cannae, Oppius did not despair of the Republic, but rather attempted to rally his mercenaries and save the city of Laodicea on the Lycus. Given Mithridates' popularity and momentum, combined with strong anti-Roman sentiment, the citizens of Laodicea decided to accept Mithridates' offer of a full pardon in exchange for Oppius and his lictors. Although Mithridates' treatment of Manius Aquillius was more dramatic, and his general massacre of Romans, Italians, and Asian allies was one of the worst atrocities of the era, the Pontic king's treatment of Oppius also became the stuff of legend. Since Oppius was not notorious like Aquillius, Mithridates chose instead to use him as an object of ridicule in order to allay fear of the Romans in Asia, a common enough sentiment. Now more of a shambling symbol than a representative of the Roman Senate, Oppius was forced to wait on Mithridates like a personal slave, and to display his submission before the Greeks and other non-Roman groups. The crowning humiliation came at Athens, a place with immense historical and cultural cachet for elite Romans. Here, Mithridates addressed the people on the world-famous Pnyx Hill, pointing to a broken Oppius as a stand-in for a fallen Roman order. It was only after 3 years of such treatment, which may have included torture, that Oppius gained his freedom, as a part of the settlement negotiated by Sulla. Shattered physically and emotionally, Oppius retreated to a temple of Asclepius on the island of Kos. We do not know the outcome of his healing journey. This is the story of the man who was the late Republic's closest analog to Theon Greyjoy. Gens Oppia was not the greatest family in Roman history. However, they were also far from being the least family. In fact, they may have very well been patrician at one point, as there were women bearing the name Oppia who served as Vestal virgins in the early Republic. For whatever reason, however, none of the men from this family managed to have a major impact, although we're pretty sure that the men from the House Oppius were always in the Senate, or at least consistently in the Senate from the beginning of the Republic until the very end. None of them achieved high office or became especially famous. So it became a long-standing tradition for those who would pay attention to such things for men named Oppius to become senators and kind of fade into the background, to be sort of your prototypical backbenchers of the Senate. And then also, by the time we get to the late Republic, the original patrician status of Gens Oppia had also been lost as the surviving branches were plebeian. It would only actually be under the early emperors where we would see the name Oppius associated with the consulship. Families who survived the Republic and could trace their lineage back were often rewarded by the early emperors, especially as the old great families had been dying off. And so they would be elevated and promoted to keep alive the memory and legacy and prestige of the Republic. So it would only be after the time of Quintus Oppius that anyone from his family would attain the pinnacle of Roman politics. And because we know very little about Quintus Oppius outside of his engagement in one conflict, the First Mithridatic War, his obscurity is actually very much par for the course for his family. If anything, because of his deeds being recorded in this war, he is actually the most famous member of his family, at least from the Republican period. Gridlock, corruption, and obstructionism resulted in the social war in Italy, whereby the Romans were compelled to fight their own allies. So Rome's allies all revolted in Italy because they demanded citizenship, which the Romans denied them. And this struggle lasted for 3 years, and for the Romans at the time, seemed like it might end up being existential. Luckily, by this point, the Republic had slain most of its foreign foes, or at least beaten them down so much that they didn't pose much of a threat. However, one foreign ruler was by no means intimidated by the Romans. In fact, he had been waiting for an opportunity for some time to take advantage of the Romans and to challenge their power. He was Mithridates VI Eupator of Pontus. He had been on the throne for years at this point, and he had been eagerly awaiting an opportunity. He knew the Romans were determined to eventually expand into the lands of their client kingdoms of Bithynia and Cappadocia, and so he figured that this was his moment. If he could take these two kingdoms while the Romans were preoccupied, he could expand his realm and also contain the Roman foothold within Asia. He also knew that both kings were deeply unpopular and that they were highly unlikely to survive without the Roman legions backing them up. Now, the Roman Senate had no way to send reinforcements because all of their troops were now busy, and the men they could have drawn upon were actually fighting them in the field. So all they could do was to send a commission headed by a man named Manius Aquillius. We only know one other name in the commission, and this is someone named Maltinus, who does nothing else. There's a pretty good chance, therefore, that one of the commissioners is our good friend Quintus Oppius, because he certainly was not the governor of Roman Asia. That would be Lucius Cassius, one of the other commanders, and otherwise we have to figure out how he got there. So my guess is that Quintus Oppius was a commissioner. Most likely, because he was chosen for this role, he was someone with some seniority. My guess would be that he was a former praetor who was now being asked to give his judgment and evaluation of affairs in Asia. There's also, therefore, a good chance that he had a little bit of previous experience in the province, but sometimes that was not the case. And also because of the way that Rome was very much strapped for experienced people to take commands, it's probably the case that Quintus Oppius didn't have that much relevant direct experience, but the Romans were going to use their best praetors and consuls as commanders in the field to fight the Italians rather than sending them on a commission. Normally, all of the members of a commission are about equally prestigious, but because there just weren't that many consulars available to travel to the east, Aquillius, as the only one in the group, was able to simply dominate the proceedings. Romans always tended to defer to superior rank. Aquillius also, for reasons we'll get into when we talk about him, had a lot of ties to this region, and so he felt like he was entitled to make decisions and pronouncements about what was best for Roman Asia. His idea was to hire a bunch of local troops to call up Rome's allies and to march in force into Bithynia and Cappadocia to restore Nicomedes and Ariobarzanes and to put Mithridates in his place early. So Aquillius was resolved to act swiftly and also decisively. What he did for this is he mandated that there would be 3 armies in the field headed by Roman commanders. Aquillius himself would lead one, Oppius another, and Lucius Cassius, the governor of Asia, would also have an army. Each of these armies would have 40,000 men and would have its own objectives. If Aquillius's army, which we know more about, is any example, that 40,000 was supposed to be their infantry strength, and they also had 4,000 horse. Aquillius would be on the western flank, moving toward Bithynia, and he would be joined by Nicomedes IV with the Bithynian army, which had nearly 60,000 men, so the western flank of this allied force would be 100,000 strong. And how accurate these numbers are is anyone's guess. Our source for this is Appian, who is not much of a military historian. In the center, Lucius Cassius, governor of Asia, will advance through Galatia. And then on the eastern flank, Quintus Oppius will lead an army, and he will be charged with entering Cappadocia to restore Ariobarzanes I, Philoromaios. Philoromaios, by the way, means lover of the Romans, a title that Ariobarzanes wins through being a staunch and loyal ally to Rome. So far as I can determine, he had no other character traits. He was a rather boring and bland figure, but from the Roman perspective, he was at least reliable and subservient, which is kind of what they wanted. given that Aquillius was putting more men on the Bithynian front than any other and commanding in person there, it is, I don't think, too unreasonable to think that he himself saw that as the decisive front. However, our focus is on Oppius, who is commanding on the secondary front in Cappadocia. So let's talk about the kingdom of Cappadocia and the local situation there. Cappadocia was founded all the way back in 331, at least officially. What had happened is that as Alexander was conquering Persia, he did not actually consolidate his control over Cappadocia, which meant that the local Persian aristocrats were able to establish themselves as a dynasty eventually, and they were able to gain support from other Persian landowners who had set up shop there. And that then led to the establishment of a kingdom over time, as the Seleucids and other successor states did not fully reduce Cappadocia to submission. As for Mithridates, his family was actually related in some way to the Cappadocian family, or at a bare minimum, both of them were of Persian descent, and also both of them could claim to have ancestors who were friends with the legendary King Darius the Great. And so, when the old dynasty died out, there was a dynastic dispute. Mithridates thought that it was okay for him to step in, and so he decided to name one of his sons as King Ariobarzanes I. So Ariobarzanes was the most common ruler name in Cappadocia, so Mithridates' son was taking up the mantle of the tradition among that family. However, the current ruler, the man who had been on the spot and who had assumed authority, was someone who was also not a member of the old dynasty, named Ariobarzanes. So he had arisen and declared himself ruler back in 95. As far as who the locals actually supported, we don't really have enough evidence to know for sure. It appears that both of these men had only a kind of limited claim to the throne. Neither one of them were particularly beloved. That being said, Ariobarzanes probably had a little bit more local support, but again, it's hard to say. As for Ariobarzanes, he is somewhat typical of a Hellenistic ruler, insofar as he tried to maintain Greek customs when it came to kingship, and he also tried to emphasize his Greekness by marrying a Greek woman. However, he will begin to move them away from Greek norms and toward Roman norms within his lifetime, as his coins will start to take on Roman features, especially after he is restored at the end of the First Mithridatic War. On paper, the Romans looked like they were in great shape. Between them, the three Roman generals had 120,000 men under their command, and Nicomedes IV had nearly 60,000 men in his Bithynian army. So on paper, they were in a great position to win this war. But in practice, things were not nearly so rosy. Not only were most of these men raw levies, but also many of them were unwilling to actually fight. And a lot of that is because Mithridates had been laying the ground for a war with Rome through a propaganda campaign for years. This was partly effective because Roman rule itself in Asia had been pretty rapacious. And so, when Mithridates reached out to locals and tried to undermine their willingness to fight, he found a receptive audience. What this caused was Nicomedes to lose his nerve when he sort of read the room and figured out what his men were up to, and he actually will pull away from Aquillius' army right before a battle. Troops are also deserting, and they're not really showing a lot of spirit in drills. The first person to find out the strategy was not going to work was Manius Aquillius, the author of the strategy. And he woke up one morning to find that Nicomedes was in full retreat, and he was now under attack, alone and unsupported, from Mithridates. So he will suffer a heavy defeat at Mount Scoroba, and then himself have to flee to Lesbos. In the meantime, Nicomedes will meet up with Cassius's army, which is in between the armies of Aquillius in the west and Oppius in the east, and they will attempt to rally and train up their men, but that task will prove hopeless. They will determine that these men are not willing to fight, and both of them will also give up any hope of making a direct stand. Cassius will actually flee to Rhodes. Nicomedes will go all the way to Rome. So The other generals have largely given up, or at least they are trying to regroup on friendly territory. But Oppius will prove to be a bit more spirited than they are, and it will not work out for him. One thing that's worth mentioning is we don't really know for sure how good communication was between the three commanders. It's possible that Oppius was not aware of the full extent of the disaster befalling his colleagues, but Appian's account gives the impression that he was, and so we'll assume for the time being that he did know that Oppius and Cassius had abandoned him. Now, by this time, his own army is also suffering from desertion. And so he is trying to figure out what he can do with his limited capacity. Some of his allies are eager to avoid being controlled by Mithridates, so he looks for a friendly city to retreat to. Part of his problem, of course, is that he doesn't have the same easy access to the coast that Oppius and Cassius have. And so he decides to try to work with the city of Laodicea on the Lycus, a city which was renowned for its black sheep, and also for having some anti-Mithridatic sentiment. So he went there, and most likely dismissed his less loyal men and kept only the mercenaries he thought would be most likely to fight well and stay loyal. He also sent a request to another city, Aphrodisias, and we know from an inscription that the men from Aphrodisias did in fact show up. So Oppius was putting together a coalition of the willing. This was most likely a very small coalition, but still, there were some people who could not countenance Mithridates, and so he was trying to assemble a group of them together. And by holding this one city, he could leave a stronghold in place and maybe then have some opportunistic raids or something of that nature once winter set in. We don't know exactly what he was thinking, but clearly he wanted to make sure that there would be a Roman presence on mainland Asia, and that Mithridates would have a thorn in his side and have to divide his troops. In the meantime, because Mithridates was doing so well, he actually arrived in Phrygia, which is the area where Laodicea on the Lycus is. And at first, Oppius's defenses are a little too strong, so he can't actually overrun the city, even though he can overrun the rest of the province without any real problem. Once Laodicea is fully isolated, perhaps within a month or so, Mithridates will then return to the city and choose to establish his camp at an ancient inn where Alexander the Great once famously spent a night. So Mithridates is once again playing up propaganda and advertising himself as a latter-day Alexander. So he's advertising himself as a formidable historic personage who's capable of taking on an enemy as great as the Romans. And this little act of propaganda will have some effect on the locals, who began to think that they're once again witnessing a world-defining conqueror. Because at this point in the campaign, Mithridates has overrun effectively the Roman province of Asia, and then the kingdoms of Cappadocia and Bithynia. He's gained a ton of land in only a few months. So all the momentum is on his side, and anything looks possible. For Mithridates, the presence of a Roman commander with a garrison of locals who were loyal to him was an embarrassment for his message of liberation from the Romans. And so he was determined to capture Laodicea on the Lycus. He had all the momentum in the world, but most likely he lacked a proper siege train. We really see no evidence that he had anything of the sort, and if we look at how he performs later against Sulla, it's also pretty apparent that the Pontic army, while large, was not necessarily that effective. It certainly was not on the same level as a full Roman army in terms of its battlefield effectiveness, engineering skills, or anything of that nature. And so he was looking for a way to take the city without having to try to assault it and potentially embarrassing himself. So what he decides to do is to use his momentum and popularity and the anti-Roman sentiment and use those as negotiating tools. His offer will be a generous one. Although Laodicea had sided against him and done quite a bit of mischief for his cause, he was willing to forgive and forget. Everyone in the city would be pardoned. All they needed to do was to officially dismiss their mercenaries. Of course, at this point, Laodicea is paying them rather than Oppius. And then hand over Oppius and his lictors. So these were generous terms, and the Laodiceans accepted them. Now, whether they had grown tired of Oppius or whether they simply wanted to save themselves, either from a bleak winter or from a potential massacre, well, they decide to help themselves. So they will arrest Oppius and his lictors. As for the mercenaries of Oppius, most of them will not only agree to be disbanded, but they will then pledge themselves to Mithridates' service. So, had it come to a battle, there's a good chance that those men would not have fought particularly well or hard for Oppius. Oppius will now have to march out with just his handful of lictors, and they will be getting jeered in a kind of carnival atmosphere as Mithridates is summoning his new Roman captive and trying to figure out exactly what to do with the guy. Because, so far as we can tell, Oppius was not really that bad, at least for a Roman. He had not really done too many things that were dishonorable or disreputable, so killing him didn't really seem to be appropriate. Something else was called for. Thus, due to betrayal, Mithridates now had 2 of the 3 Roman commanders as captives. Manius Aquillius was notoriously greedy and cruel, or at least his father had been, and so Mithridates decided to make an object lesson of him with one of the most memorable executions in ancient history. As for the less vile Oppius, his fate arguably was crueler. For an ancient Roman aristocrat, honor was everything. Honor was lifeblood, and it was what they were raised to defend to the death. Roman aristocrats were very particular about their honor, and to live without honor was a sufficient cause for one to take one's life. Yet, for Oppius, he would be compelled to be humiliated by being lowered to work as a slave, and then to be paraded about in public in this guise. We don't know what all humiliations were inflicted upon him, but given the extreme emphasis on honor and dignity, his lack of those things for 3 years straight certainly means that he probably suffered more in the end than even Oppius. The worst part of his experience as a prisoner came fairly early. So Mithridates, after he captured Oppius and executed Aquillius, will then go to Athens with part of his army and address the Athenian people there. Now, Athens has this great cultural resonance both for the Hellenistic rulers of Asia Minor and for the Romans. It is this place that has an ancient and venerable intellectual tradition. It also had a proud political tradition. Even if the Romans were not super into democracy, still, they could respect the military achievements, certainly, of ancient Athens. Well, here he was, in the city where all the monuments were world famous. The Parthenon, the Pnyx Hill, the Theater of Dionysus. And he is taken before one of the most cultured bodies of men in the ancient world, the Athenian people, who are accustomed to hearing learned speeches. And he's in a place where famous men like Themistocles and Pericles, Iphicrates, Plato, Isocrates, and many others had either sat or talked. And he's up on display as an object lesson of why Rome is no longer relevant in the East. And the man who captured him, Mithridates, is bad-mouthing him and the city that he was supposed to represent. And so from Oppius' perspective, no humiliation could possibly be worse. This was as bad as it got. This was worse than death. It's also completely possible, although we don't know for sure, that Quintus Oppius was physically tortured in some way. But even if he wasn't, just this treatment alone would be enough to break a man psychologically if he was raised with the kind of prickly self-regard that Roman senators were brought up with. We don't know too many details of Oppius' life for the next 3 years, aside from the fact that he was still Mithridates' personal slave, and that the king liked to humiliate him in various ways. So for 3 more years, Oppius was being punished, at least psychologically, on a daily basis. It would only be in 85 when he was finally set free. and that's because in 85, Sulla and Mithridates agreed to a peace deal which officially brought the First Mithridatic War to a close. Effectively, what happened is that rather than finishing the conflict by destroying Pontus, Sulla instead contented himself with defeating the Pontic army in the field and negotiating a settlement whereby Mithridates would withdraw from his ill-gotten gains and they would restore the status quo ante. Part of that deal is that Quintus Oppius would be free to return to his normal life. After his ordeal, however, Oppius was not eager to get back to a Rome which was still embroiled in civil war, this time between Sulla and his political opponents, the Marians. Instead of getting back into politics, Oppius instead decided to go to a temple of Asclepius, the god of healing, located on the island of Kos, and here he hoped to recover his spirits and his health. We have no idea what ultimately happened to Quintus Oppius. Perhaps he did recover and return to Rome to take up his place in the Senate. If so, most likely he was received with some degree of honor, since he had tried to fight for Rome to the best of his abilities, and he had suffered a level of humiliation that few other Romans had ever been asked to endure. However, it's also possible that he never went back to Rome, and that he chose to live out the remainder of his days on the island of Kos. Perhaps he was simply too broken and too shattered to resume a political life. We'll never know, because he never appears again in the historical record. We can say, however, that most likely his last days were not particularly happy. That kind of trauma can be very difficult to recover from, and given the pride and fragility of a Roman senator's ego, it's pretty hard to imagine that this was something he could get over easily, particularly when Sulla had failed to prosecute the war to a just conclusion in the Roman perspective, i.e. the destruction of Pontus and the death of Mithridates. Typically speaking, the consequences for failure in the ancient world for an aristocrat were not all that dire compared to normal life for your average slave. Things would never get so bad that you would feel like a literal slave if you were an aristocrat who lost a battle or got captured. You would have ransom value, and usually the ruling class of one power would honor the ruling class of the other. It was a kind of courtesy. They shared a culture, at least a Greek culture, that made them able to communicate and gave them some measure of respect. Hannibal, for instance, when he'd capture Romans, would treat them with some degree of dignity, at least if they were of a certain rank. So it was unthinkable for Quintus Oppius, if he were imagining what horrors might await him when he was captured, to imagine himself as a slave. Maybe he'd be executed. That's possible. Maybe he would be ransomed. Who knows what might happen? Maybe he'd be put under house arrest somewhere. But certainly not paraded about in this way, and possibly physically abused as well. That was beyond the pale. That was abnormal. And so his life was one which was highly improbable. It was something that neither he nor his contemporaries were intellectually equipped to understand, because this simply couldn't happen. And yet it did. Many Romans would die in battle, but very few of them would ever end up being treated as slaves for 3 years, or being humiliated in such a systematic way. So what he went through was very different than what most Roman senators went through. Not only that, but he might have been the only Roman senator who actually had first-hand experience of what it meant to be a slave. So one wonders if he had certain thoughts on the experience of being a POW or the experience of being a slave. But we'll never know. And he never had a chance to make much of an impact after his captivity. The real significance of his life, unfortunately for him, is that Mithridates' effort to make him into a symbol was successful. Mithridates proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he fucking hated the Romans. He did the general massacre of Romans in Asia, along with the Italians and the Asian collaborators. That was his most famous deed. He also killed Aquillius in a way which became iconic. But the humiliation of Oppius was also a display of Mithridates' contempt for the Romans, and it should come as no surprise that ultimately the Romans will hunt him down and kill him under the leadership of Pompey all the way in 63 BCE. So this will be a long, drawn-out process, and in all likelihood, Quintus Oppius did not live long enough to see justice done to the man who had captured and tortured him. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. Always keep in mind, if you want to be any character from Game of Thrones, Theon Greyjoy is probably not the best option.